Does cholesterol cause heart disease? I know it's kind of an odd question in 2024, and it should have probably already been answered by now in the medical community. And yes, we will answer that question. If you guys don't know me, I'm Dr. Allo. I'm a double board certified cardiologist. I'm also writing a book on cholesterol, so that textbook is about to be out. Now, this is not a lipidology textbook because those are very complicated, and only cardiologists usually or medical professionals would read the lipidology textbooks. The book that I'm writing is more for normal, everyday people. Everything you need to know about cholesterol. It is called, or most likely going to be called, Cholesterol Truths, and it is almost done. So, with that said, it is 2024, and the fact that we are asking this question means that there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of people out there on social media, on this platform, other platforms, that are all talking about, does cholesterol cause heart disease, or does it really cause heart disease? Or what about this one study that showed that this happens and that happens, and this study showed that LDL cholesterol this and cholesterol that, and the people with the highest cholesterols live the longest, and the people with the lowest cholesterols died the most, and what's going on here? Can somebody please explain it? So, if you have been watching or just scrolling through the internet on social media and on here, you're probably getting a lot of mixed signals. There are some people, like actual cardiologists, who are saying, yeah, why is this even a question? We know without question now that LDL cholesterol, or ApoB, causes atherosclerosis, and this really shouldn't even be a question that we're asking. There are a lot of other people who are non-cardiologists, not cholesterol experts, not lipidologists. Lipidologists are just people who've had excessive and very special training in how to deal with lipids and lipoproteins, which is cholesterol transport, how cholesterol affects the body, how to treat it, diagnose it, etc. They have extra training in that, and they have an extra board certification. So no cardiologist or lipidologist is going around telling people that cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Now, there may be one or two here and there who are probably not practicing cardiologists and are trying to sell a contrarian book or something like that. They're trying to sell a book about cholesterol's not really the bad guy. But generally speaking, the vast majority of cardiologists and lipidologists and almost everybody in the world, no matter where you go, believes that cholesterol causes atherosclerosis. And we'll go through why. Don't just take my word for it. So if you look at the European Atherosclerotic Society, the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, the South American, Cardiology Conference, the New Zealand, Australian, Eastern European, Russian, Middle Eastern even, North African, whatever it is, if you look at all of the societal guidelines in the world, the Canadians, the Mexicans, as well, all of them say that get your cholesterol down to basically as low as possible, depending on what risk factors you have or what conditions you've already had. We may recommend for it to be quite low. If you go back to one of my other videos called LDL targets, what should your LDL targets be? I'll go over them briefly here. But generally speaking, all comers, your LDL should be under 100. If you have at least one risk factor, it should be under 70. This would be like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, age, smoker, etc. If you've had one ischemic event, this is like you've had one heart attack or stroke, then we recommend for you to be under 55. If you've had multiple ischemic events, then we recommend for you to be under 40 milligrams per deciliter. That's the LDL target. So now how do we know that LDL cholesterol, or ApoB, ApoB is another name for it. I've done multiple, lectures on that. Scroll back a little bit and look up, LDL versus ApoB. What's the difference between LDL and ApoB? ApoB is ApoB, beta, like B. So Brian Ferentz went through this with the European Atherosclerotic Society, and they looked through the data in the literature. They looked at every single study that has ever been done on LDL cholesterol, which is what we consider the atherogenic or bad cholesterol. But he wanted to prove that this is actually the bad cholesterol. Like, is this just a correlation? Does it just happen to be that all the people who died or had heart disease just coincidentally had high LDL? Was it just a correlation, or was it causation? Because a lot of people try to say, well, it correlates highly with atherosclerosis, and it correlates highly with death, with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, heart attack, stroke, etc. But is it the actual cause, or is it like an innocent bystander that happens to be there? A lot of these people use the analogy of if there's a forest fire, the firemen get there to put it out. And in their scenario, in this example, they're saying, well, LDL cholesterol is the fireman coming to put out the fire, whereas it's the forest fire that is actually causing atherosclerosis. This is not true, and we'll get into why. So, Brian Ferentz wanted to look at this exact question. Can we have atherosclerosis without LDL cholesterol? Is LDL cholesterol this innocent bystander that is coming in to put out the fire or patch up the damage or the inflammation? Is it really inflammation? Is it really insulin resistance? Is it any of these other things that is causing it? And LDL cholesterol just happens to be there because it's part of the process. If you've watched my debate with Paul Saladino, the carnivore MD, who actually is no longer carnivore, by the way, and he doesn't recommend it for anyone because of all the health risks and harms. But if you watch my video, the argument that they always give is that, well, LDL cholesterol is just an innocent bystander. They just show up to help put out the fire. It's this fire that's causing it, and they want to blame insulin resistance and inflammation and damage and all this stuff as the actual cause. And we'll get into why that isn't. But that LDL cholesterol comes in to patch it up and like heal it, which is absolutely not true, obviously. So Brian Ferentz went through the criteria of causation. What criteria must be met to prove that something is causal of the disease and not just like correlates or happens to be there? Like a lot of times in these studies, they'll say, well, people that eat a lot of fish are also not eating, cheeseburgers and hamburgers and dry, ultra processed food and junk food, and not likely to be smokers or obese or overweight because they're health conscious. They eat fish because they want to be healthy. There's a healthy user bias. So while they're eating fish, it's not the fish that caused the improvement in health outcomes. It's really their overall pattern of behavior, their love of food, their food, they eat healthier food, they exercise, they don't smoke, they're not overweight, they follow a lot of healthy user habits, which is called a healthy user bias in these kind of studies. And maybe that's why the fish correlated with being healthier, because these kind of people that eat fish twice a week are generally trying to be healthier anyways. They're out running marathons and doing yoga and body, lifting weights and stuff like that. So Brian Ferentz wanted to eliminate all that. What criteria must be met to prove with absolute certainty that LDL cholesterol is by itself the causative agent of atherosclerosis? So they looked at every study that has ever been done on LDL cholesterol. And the reason they use LDL cholesterol and not ApoB, ApoB is a stricter, better marker for atherosclerosis, but the older studies, we didn't have ApoB reported. Not all of them did. So LDL cholesterol is a close enough approximation of ApoB in most people. In about 80 to 90% of people, the LDL cholesterol and the ApoB run together. You could also use non-HDL, which correlates or, is a surrogate for ApoB a little more precisely. So let's just put it that way. So they did this study and they said, what criteria needs to be met? And they went through all the criteria of causation. This agent by itself, this LDL cholesterol, the LDL concentration, let's say, the LDL cholesterol concentration in milligrams per deciliter, or in non-American, international would be like nanomoles per liter, or millimoles per liter. They went through that and they found that LDL cholesterol by itself was sufficient to cause atherosclerosis. You did not need inflammation. You did not need insulin resistance. You did not need heart damage. You didn't need a bad diet. You didn't need anything. And how did they come up with this? So there's a lot of different ways. So looking at all of the studies, and I'll put the graphs and charts up here. And the number one way they looked at it is Mendelian randomization. For those of you who don't understand what Mendelian randomization is, this is people who were randomized at birth. Some people were born with various genetic mutations that gave them very low LDL cholesterol. Some people with super high LDL cholesterol, like familial hypercholesterolemia. These are people with like the LDL receptor gene mutations and other like forms of homozygous or heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. This just means super high genetic cholesterol. And as you come down to people with like PCSK9 loss of function mutations and a multitude of other mutations that can cause you to have very low LDL cholesterol. And they found that it was a straight line. People with the lowest LDL cholesterol had almost no atherosclerosis, and people with the highest LDL cholesterol, regardless of anything else, had the most atherosclerosis, the most cardiovascular events, heart attacks and strokes, peripheral artery disease, renal artery stenosis, ischemic bowel, everything. Death from MI, death from heart attacks, death from strokes, CV deaths, all-cause mortality, everything. You add it all up. It's just a straight line. It's that top line in the chart here, and I'll keep it up here maybe. It's that top line at the top that says Mendelian randomization. And this is a chapter in my book. Those of you who want the new cholesterol book, it's called Cholesterol Truths. Most likely that will be the title. And it's coming out soon. If you want to know when it's coming out, go to drallo.net/cholesterol, drallo.net/cholesterol, and type in your name. You can read all of the forewords by all of the amazing people that have written forwards and endorsed this book. You are going to find some of the most amazing people in the world. Dr. Thomas Dayspring, who's the world's foremost educator on cholesterol and lipids. He's a lipidologist as well. Got Professor Kaushik Ray, who's a physician in Europe. He is the president of the European Atherosclerotic Society. We have about 4 or 5 different very famous, very well-known cardiologists and physicians here in the United States. We have Lane Norton. Dr. Lane Norton is a PhD in nutritional sciences. We have Alan Aragon. We have Dr. Matthew Nagra, Dr. Ron Grisanti, Abir Berry, Matthew Phillips, Terry Simpson, Danielle Belardo, very well-known cardiologist out of the Los Angeles area, huge following online. All of these people, and a bunch more that Patty Barrett, Dr. Patty Barrett out of Ireland, very huge following online. All of these people have endorsed this book and written forward. So when you have really heavy hitters and people who know what they're talking about, they all have PhDs, they all have doctorate degrees, they are all endorsing this book on cholesterol, then it's got to be solid. It's taken me almost a year and a half to write it, and it's finally in the last few phases. We're just, finishing up some illustrations and graphics. Anyways, that is the Mendelian randomization studies. People who are randomized at birth, you get low cholesterol, you get high cholesterol, you get medium cholesterol, you get a little bit high, you get a little bit low, you get a little bit here in between, and then you just stratify them. Who had the most cardiovascular events and who had the least. Super simple to do. It's not rocket science. The next thing that they looked at was randomized control trials. And these are trials where they looked at, what if we gave people this drug and this drug combined with this drug and this lifestyle intervention. These are randomized control trials. These are prospective trials where we look at an intervention. For example, the Jupiter trial. I talk about this a lot in the book, and it's been talked about quite a bit in online and whatever. People with an LDL cholesterol of 57 or lower, this was a rosuvastatin 20. People had a high CRP, high inflammation, 2.0 or higher, with a normal LDL cholesterol at the time, what we thought was normal, like up to 130 at that time was considered normal. We put them on rosuvastatin 20, cuts their cholesterol, for some people about 30%, for some people about 55, and maybe even 60%. What we found is that the lower the LDL cholesterol, regardless of anything else, they all did better. Less cardiovascular events, less mortality, less death rates, 44% reduction in all endpoints. The first trial that's ever been done that showed a 46% reduction in women as well. A lot of prior cardiovascular trials did not include enough women because we didn't think women got heart disease. Obviously, that's not true. It is also the number one killer of women. But also showed in women had a 46% reduction. So all comers, the entire trial, 44% reduction in all cardiovascular endpoints, heart attacks, strokes, non-fatal MI, fatal MI, death rates, cardiovascular death rates, all-cause mortality, etc. They found that the number needed to treat was anywhere from about 25 up to 95, depending on which endpoint you were looking at. And these are randomized control trials. You have the West of Scotland trial, which we now have 20-year data on. There was a 6% absolute risk reduction. 6% absolute is humongous. We have 20-year data on the West of Scotland trial. There were some people that were in that trial for just those 4 to 5 years and then completely got off statins. And now 20 years later, they are doing better because they were on that medicine for just a handful of years than other people that did not. The people that stayed on it, indefinitely or longer obviously did even better. So we have a lot of data from these randomized control trials. And then we have something called cohort studies. These are let's take a population like the nurses, population. I forget the name of it. Nurses, physicians, something population study. There's this cohort of people, say in Boston. They're all nurses, or healthcare professionals. And we look at them. You say, let's take a look at them. compare smokers to smokers, BMI of 30 to BMI of 30, people who work out to people who don't work out, all of that taken together, we look at their LDL cholesterols and we see what is the difference. If all else being equal, those with the lowest LDL cholesterols had the least amount of cardiovascular events, death rates, all-cause mortality, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. Now, obviously, some of them were put on statins. Some of them had an MI and were put on statins later. It just depends, but they looked at all of that. All of the confounding variables were also looked at, so that's very important to note. So that was the first part of their study where they looked at Mendelian randomization, cohort studies, prospective cohort studies, and randomized controlled trials. Now, you can't really get better than that, but they went through this gigantic discussion, and I'll link it below, of why and how they did this. Now, the best part, which people don't want to talk about, is this included every trial. People are like, what about that one study? They'll point to a study, and it's not even a study. A lot of times it's just an opinion piece. They point to this study that's like LDL cholesterol and saturated fat may not be the boogeyman that we thought it was. First of all, that's an editorial. That's an opinion piece. That is not a study. They might be like, oh, what about this study? And it says, oh, study shows that in these 200 people, something happened and their LDL did not predict heart disease. Or what about this centenarian study where the people who lived to 100 had the slightly higher cholesterol than those who didn't? Well, that was like 1,000 people, and their cholesterol was 1 point higher than the others. So those are just nonsense studies. But Brian Farron said, what if we took all of those studies and put them all together? What if we looked at every single study that has ever been done on LDL cholesterol and then look at the data? And that's what they did. They took every single study that has ever been published since the beginning of time on LDL cholesterol to see if LDL cholesterol actually caused atherosclerosis. And this is what they came up with. They ended up with over 20 million person years of follow-up. So if you don't know what 20 million person years of follow-up is, let's say we follow 10 million people for 2 years. That's 2 times 10, that's 20 million. Or we follow 1 million people for 20 years. That's also 20 million person years of follow-up. Or we follow, let's say, 2 million people for 10 years. The math can math. You can easily figure that out. But they looked at all of the studies, all of the people in there, for how many total years of follow-up, for how many ways we followed up with them, and this is what they came up with. And it's basically conclusive. The final conclusions of this study and the amount of people that are listed on the study is just enormous. It's like the entire world of the European world of cardiology was listed on this study. Almost every investigator, every scientist, every researcher, everyone who's ever published anything in the realm of cardiology was on this. Now, obviously, none of these people are trying to sell you a book that says cholesterol is okay. Those scammers are always going to be out there. But they put all of their names on this study. They all contributed in some fashion or form. And their final conclusion was LDL cholesterol causes ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And that was it. It was super simple, super robust, easy to do. Now, what about inflammation and damage and insulin resistance? Those studies have also been done. We can talk about those in another video, and I have, or in my podcast too. If you just search Dr. Allo Show on your favorite podcast player, you can find that, and maybe we'll do some follow-up videos on that so that you can kind of see the other stuff. But Tabas and Williams, T-A-B-A-S and Williams, published a study in 1995 or maybe 96, as well as another one, I think 2007, as a follow-up. They wanted to disprove the 1970s thought process. In the 1970s, we used to believe that there was damage done to the arterial wall and cholesterol came in to patch it up, right? That was the prevailing thinking. Unfortunately, a lot of physicians and some of these people you hear online, or these medfluencers, are kind of stuck in that thinking. They think that you need to have damage done to the arterial wall or inflammation or insulin resistance or some horrific thing going on, and then LDL cholesterol and cholesterol comes to patch it up. Unfortunately, that was 1975, I believe. The scientific world likes to outsmart each other and outdo each other and prove each other wrong. So for the next 20 years, they tried to prove these things correct or incorrect. So Tabas and Williams in 1996 published their huge, long, very well done study on what actually causes atherosclerosis. Is it the response to injury, like we thought in the early to mid 70s, or is it a response to retention? That's kind of where we wanted to go with this. The response to injury was what I was talking about in the early 70s, where we thought you needed damage and cholesterol came to patch it up. In 1995, when they published this response to retention, they tested damage. They went into arteries and scratched them up and caused a scab or denudation. We call that denuding the artery. They would denude the artery, cause damage to it, and see if that area became atherosclerotic. And it did not. But the good, healthy, intact endothelium that was next to it, the artery that was next to it that was healthy, that developed atherosclerosis. They also went in to see if inflammation caused it. They would cause inflammation, increase inflammatory markers, check people with high inflammation versus people without. They would, do things to increase inflammation, all of that. They checked shear stress. They said, well, maybe it's the shear stress, like really high blood pressure. Maybe it was branch points in the arteries that developed atherosclerosis. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. They tested all of it. Maybe it's oxidation. They tested all of these theories in a very, very well done way. They found out that none of those things actually caused atherosclerosis, or they were not necessary for atherosclerosis. Let's put it that way. None of those things were necessary. The only thing that was necessary was a retention of an LDL particle. The LDL particle, this is the lumen of your arterial wall. The LDL particle gets in there. Now it's here and it gets retained. I like to show this model all the time. This is normal endothelium here. Particles get stuck. Once they get stuck and retained, that's when things start going bad. So that's what happens. That's when we came up with the response to retention theory. LDL particles get into the endothelium. It's a one-cell layer, and they aggregate, they get retained, they get stuck in there, and that's when the atherosclerotic process begins and eventually ends your life, usually too. And then they republished, I think in 2007 or so, sort of an updated version of that article, and I have them all linked up in my cholesterol book if you want it. Like I said, drallo.net/cholesterol. Super close to a publication date and final draft here. But if you enjoy stuff like this, I highly recommend you follow me. Send this to somebody who needs to hear it, because there's a lot of people out there with a lot of misinformation that just don't know, and they do need to know. So send this to them. I'll catch you in the next episode. Peace.